1,000 workers, 1,000 guitars a day. Kalamazoo, Michigan, the home of guitars. Gibson built the Les Paul, the ES-335, the instruments that gave American music its voice for a century. Then the company reached for something else, a CEO who decided guitars weren't big enough. $135 million for a consumer electronics company that made Philips headphones. Robot tuners bolted onto instruments that never needed them. And a player revolt that followed. $500 million in debt. A Chapter 11. Filing on May 1st, 2018, the company that built the Les Paul admitting in federal court that it needed to go back to building guitars. The factory in Kalamazoo has been quiet for 40 years now. The Memphis plant is a shipping warehouse. Nashville still builds them. This is the story of how a craftsman named Orville Gibson carved an idea out of solid wood in 1894, and how the company that carried his name spent a century becoming American royalty, then nearly destroyed itself, not by forgetting how to build, but by deciding that building wasn't enough, not through a single disaster, through a long series of decisions, each one reaching a little further from the wood where the sound began. The story begins in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in 1894, with a man who wasn't trying to build a guitar empire. He was trying to solve a sound problem. Orville H. Gibson was born in 1856, the son of a British immigrant who'd settled in upstate New York. By his late 30s, Orville had landed in Kalamazoo, a small city in southwestern Michigan better known for celery farming, paper mills, and a stove factory than for anything musical. He wasn't conservatory trained. He didn't come from money. What he had was a workshop on East Main Street, a set of wood-carving tools, and an obsession that nobody else in American instrument making was pursuing, that you could carve the top and back of a stringed instrument the way a violin maker did, arching the wood, shaping it from a solid piece, and produce a resonance that flat-top construction simply couldn't touch. This wasn't decoration. It was architecture. A carved top vibrates differently than a flat one braced from beneath. It resonates from the wood itself, not from the tension holding it together. The sound is rounder, more complex, with a sustain that carries overtones a flat top swallows. Orville understood that distinction before most American luthiers had even considered it, and in 1898 he filed a single patent to prove it. One patent. That's all he ever filed. U.S. Patent number 598,245 for a mandolin with a carved arch-top body and sides bent from a single piece of wood became the founding technical act of one of the most important instrument companies in American history. He sold his instruments locally at first. Kalamazoo was small enough that word traveled on foot. Players noticed the sound, fuller, louder, with a projection that carried across a parlor or a small hall without strain, and they noticed the craftsmanship. Orville's instruments had an ornamental quality, carved scroll work, and inlays that matched the sonic ambition with visual ambition. He wasn't building cheap goods for catalog sales. He was building things he believed in, one at a time in a rented shop, and selling them to anyone in Kalamazoo who understood what they were hearing. Here's the detail that lifts Orville's story beyond a simple founder's tale. He didn't build the company that carries his name. Not really. In 1902, 5 Kalamazoo businessmen, local investors, not musicians, recognized the commercial potential in what Orville saw as a craft. They bought his patent and his name and incorporated the Gibson Mandolin Guitar Manufacturing Company, Limited. The price of that transaction is lost to history. What survived is the outcome. Orville stayed on briefly as a consultant, but the enterprise that would make Gibson, a word known to every guitarist alive, was someone else's operation from almost the very beginning. The 5 partners, Silvo Reams, Lewis Williams, Leroy Hornbeck, John Adams, and Samuel Van Horn, weren't builders. They were businessmen who saw a market in the mandolin craze sweeping American parlor culture, and they had the organizational instincts to turn Orville's one-man workshop into a manufacturing concern. They hired workers who could execute the carved top method at commercial volume, rented a factory on East Exchange Place, and began producing instruments under the Gibson name with a consistency that Orville alone could never have achieved. Orville himself drifted away. The historical record is thin on his reasons, whether it was disillusionment, mental illness, or simply the temperament of a craftsman who'd never wanted to run a business. He spent his later years in and out of a state hospital in St. Lawrence, Michigan, and died there in 1918 at 62, 16 years after signing over the idea that would outlive him by more than a century. The company kept his name on the headstock. It never put his face on a poster, never told his story in advertisements, never made him the center of the mythology that grew around the brand. The founder became a ghost inside his own creation, present in the name, absent from everything else. That absence is part of the story because what those 5 businessmen bought wasn't just a patent. It was a principle. That an instrument's sound begins in the way you shape the wood, and that craft isn't a marketing claim. It's a structural decision. Every Gibson ever built, from the cheapest student model to the most expensive custom shop reissue, descends from that principle, and every disaster that later struck the company can be measured against the same question. How far did they drift from what the wood was supposed to do? We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. The Gibson mandolin guitar manufacturing company's early decades were steady rather than spectacular. The mandolin was the instrument of the moment. Parlor music, amateur ensembles, the kind of genteel middle-class entertainment that thrived before recorded music remade everything. And Gibson's carved-top mandolins were among the finest you could buy. The company grew modestly, hired carefully, and built its reputation on quality in a market crowded with cheaper alternatives. But 2 people arrived in Kalamazoo who'd pushed the company far beyond modest. Lloyd Loar walked through Gibson's door around 1919, and what he carried with him was the bridge between Orville's original insight and the modern instrument. Loar was an acoustician, a performing musician, and an engineer, the rare figure who could hear what was wrong with a sound and then draft what would fix it. He redesigned Gibson's mandolin line from the inside out, applying principles borrowed from violin acoustics. F-holes instead of oval sound holes, graduated top thicknesses tuned to specific resonant frequencies, and a construction philosophy that treated each instrument as an acoustic system, rather than an assembled object. His masterpiece was the F5 mandolin, introduced in 1922. The F-holes were shaped to move air more efficiently. The top was graduated, thicker at the center, thinner toward the edges, to let the wood vibrate in a pattern that amplified overtones instead of swallowing them. The tone bar under the bass side of the top was Loar's own addition, borrowed from violin construction, tuning the instrument's voice the way a builder tunes a concert hall. Mandolin players heard the F5 and recognized it instantly as something new. Bluegrass musicians still consider it the benchmark a century later. An original Loar-signed F5 in good condition can sell for $300,000 or more, not because of the signature, but because the sound remains that good. But Loar's tenure also revealed something about Gibson that would repeat itself for decades. He wanted to experiment with electric amplification in the mid-1920s, years before anyone else in the industry was seriously pursuing it. He'd built prototype pickups, tested them on Gibson instruments, and believed the electric guitar was coming, whether the industry was ready or not. Gibson's management wasn't interested. Too risky. Too strange. The mandolin sold fine. Loar left in 1924, frustrated, and the company that would later become synonymous with the electric guitar had turned away its first chance to lead that revolution. What Gibson did embrace was the structural innovation that Ted McHugh patented in 1921, the adjustable truss rod, a steel rod threaded through a channel in the guitar's neck, adjustable by turning a nut, that counteracted the forward pull of string tension and prevented warping. Before the truss rod, a guitar neck was a gamble. Humidity, temperature, string gauge, any of them could pull the wood out of true over a single season. McHugh's invention solved that, and because Gibson held the patent, every competitor who wanted a reliable neck had to either license it or engineer around it. The truss rod didn't make headlines. It didn't appear on posters. What it did was make industrial-scale guitar manufacturing possible, because you could now build a neck in Kalamazoo in January and ship it to a customer in New Orleans in July with reasonable confidence that it would still play correctly when it arrived. Gibson survived the Depression. Barely. With reduced staff and leaner production runs, the company kept its doors open through the early 1930s because instruments occupy a peculiar niche in the American economy. People hold on to them. You might not buy a new guitar in 1932, but you'd repair the one you had and you weren't throwing it away. Gibson's reputation for durability, for building instruments that lasted, kept enough revenue flowing to avoid the fate of dozens of smaller competitors who simply vanished. Then the electric guitar arrived, and Gibson arrived with it. Late, but not too late. The EH-150, introduced in 1935, was Gibson's first production electric instrument, a Hawaiian-style lap steel with a horseshoe pickup that pushed sound through an amplifier for the first time under the Gibson name. A year later came the model that mattered, the ES-150, a full-sized arch-top guitar fitted with an electromagnetic bar pickup, sold with a matching amplifier for a combined price of about $150, hence the name. The ES stood for Electric Spanish, Gibson's designation for a standard guitar shape as opposed to the horizontal Hawaiian style. It was a filing code. The instrument was a revolution. Jazz guitarist Charlie Christian got his hands on an ES-150 in 1937, and within 2 years he'd changed the direction of American popular music. Playing single-note melodic lines through the amplified guitar, at a time when the instrument was still considered a rhythm section timekeeper, Christian demonstrated that the electric guitar could be a solo voice, a lead instrument, as expressive and individual as a saxophone or a trumpet. He didn't choose the ES-150 because Gibson had better advertising. He chose it because the instrument's tone was warm, articulate, and loud enough to cut through a big band. The pickup responded to his touch. The wood, still carved, still shaped by Orville's principle, gave the amplified signal a richness that cheaper instruments couldn't match. Christian died of tuberculosis in 1942 at 25, but the door he'd kicked open stayed open, and Gibson was standing on the right side of it. The company that had sent Lloyd Loar away a decade earlier was now, almost reluctantly, one of the leading makers of electric instruments in America. Not because management had planned it, because the builders on the floor in Kalamazoo kept making things that players couldn't put down. And then came the man who'd turn a respected workshop into an American institution. Ted McCarty arrived at Gibson in 1948 as general manager, a businessman with a degree from the University of Cincinnati and an instinct for product development that few instrument executives have ever matched. What he found was a company with enormous potential trapped inside modest ambitions. Gibson made fine instruments. It employed about 150 people. It produced roughly 5,000 instruments a year, respectable for a regional manufacturer. McCarty didn't want respectable. He wanted dominant. His first move was to study what players actually needed. The solid-body electric guitar was coming. Leo Fender's Telecaster hit the market in 1951, a brash, simple bolt-neck instrument that was cheap to build and projected like nothing before it. Fender was outselling Gibson in the electric market, and McCarty understood that the response couldn't be nostalgia. It had to be a better instrument. So he went to Les Paul. Les Paul was already a star, a guitarist, inventor, and showman who'd been experimenting with solid-body electrics for years, including his famous log, a 4x4 piece of lumber with a pickup bolted on. McCarty and Les Paul struck a deal. Gibson would build the guitar. Les Paul would lend his name and his input. The result, introduced in 1952, was nothing like the Fender. Where the Telecaster was utilitarian, the Gibson Les Paul was luxurious. A carved maple top over a mahogany body, bound edges, gold hardware, and a pair of P90 pickups that produced a fatter, warmer tone than Fender's bright single coils. It cost more. It weighed more. It sounded like nothing else on the market, but McCarty wasn't done with one model. The humbucking pickup, developed by Gibson engineer Seth Lover and patented in 1959, solved the single-coil hum problem that had plagued electric guitars since their invention. Two coils wound in opposite directions, canceling the interference noise while thickening the signal. The PAF, patent applied for. Sticker on those early humbuckers became one of the most fetishized details in guitar history. Players still argue about the exact specifications, the wire gauge, the magnet composition, As if the secret of tone could be decoded from a winding machine settings, McCarty kept pushing. The ES-335, the Flying V, the Explorer. The SG, introduced in 1961 as a redesigned Les Paul, thinner, lighter, double cutaway, with devilish horns that became the visual signature of hard rock. Each model answered a different question about what a guitar could look like, sound like, feel like in a player's hands. And all of it was built in Kalamazoo. The factory at 225 Parsons Street had been Gibson's home since 1917. By the McCarty years, it had expanded into a sprawling complex of connected buildings, brick, concrete, loading docks, high windows letting Michigan light onto the work floor, that covered enough ground to hold more than 1,000 workers on a busy shift. From the outside, it looked like any Midwestern manufacturing plant, no different from the auto parts suppliers and paper mills scattered across southern Michigan. But you could smell the difference before you walked through the door. Lacquer and sawdust and machine oil, a scent specific enough that workers' families said they could tell where the paycheck came from before it was cashed. Inside, the complex was organized around a production flow that turned raw timber into some of the most coveted objects in American popular culture. Raw lumber arrived at one end, maple from the Great Lakes region, mahogany from Central America and Africa, rosewood from Brazil and India, spruce for the tops of acoustic instruments, ebony for fretboards, dense and dark, and so hard it could dull a saw blade in minutes. The wood went first to the drying rooms, where it seasoned for months before anyone touched it with a cutting tool. Gibson's builders understood what every serious luthier knows. Rush the wood and the instrument warps. Dry it too fast and the grain cracks. The patience started before the first saw blade spun. From the drying rooms, the wood moved to the rough mill, where blanks were cut for bodies, necks, and tops. The carved tops, still Orville's principle, still the company's deepest signature, were shaped on specialized copy carving machines, and then hand-finished by workers who could feel the difference between a top that was right and one that was close. That distinction was what separated Gibson from cheaper makers, and the hands that made the judgment had usually learned it from someone who'd been making the same judgment for 2 decades. The neck department had its own rhythm and its own vocabulary. Necks were carved from mahogany blanks, fitted with truss rods, and shaped to profiles that had names inside the factory. A 59 profile was different from a 60. Thicker at the first fret, rounder in the palm, and players could tell the difference blindfolded. The fret wire was pressed into slots cut by saw, then filed, crowned, and polished until each fret sat level to tolerances that most people would need a magnifying glass to appreciate. The binding, that white or cream strip running along the body's edge, was heated, bent by hand to follow the instrument's contours, glued into its channel, and scraped flush. It was detail work, the kind that doesn't show up in a photograph but shows up instantly when a guitarist runs a hand along the body's edge and feels either craftsmanship or its absence. Assembly brought the pieces together, neck into body, bolted or glued, depending on the model. Pickups seated into routed cavities. Wiring soldered by hand. Gibson's wiring harnesses used braided cloth wire, not the plastic-coated stuff cheaper companies used, and the solder joints were expected to hold for decades. Hardware-mounted, bridge, tailpiece, tuning machines, pickguard, output jack, strings threaded through, and then the instrument moved to the finishing department. Finishing was its own world. Nitrocellulose lacquer, nitro, was sprayed in thin coats, each one dried under heat lamps, sanded smooth, sprayed again. 4 coats, 5 coats, sometimes more, building up the glossy surface that Gibson players would later argue about with the passion of theologians debating doctrine. Nitro lacquer breathes. It ages, it yellows over decades, it develops hairline cracks called checking, it wears through where a player's forearm rests against the body or a belt buckle drags across the back. That aging would later become a selling point, proof that the instrument had been played, had lived, had earned its scars. But in the Parsons Street finishing room, a checked finish was a flaw to be caught before it left the building. The final station was inspection. Every instrument was played, checked for finish defects, measured for intonation, and either approved or sent back. In the McCarty years, the rejection rate was a point of pride. A guitar that didn't meet the standard didn't ship. The inspector's job was to protect the name on the headstock, and the name meant something specific, not perfection, because no handmade object is perfect, but seriousness. A commitment to getting it right that justified the premium on the price tag and the loyalty of the players who paid it. At its peak, the Parsons Street complex moved more than 1,000 instruments a day through this sequence. Raw wood to finished product, morning to evening, shift after shift. More than 1,000 workers showed up each day to make it happen. The scale was industrial. The product was personal. That tension is what made Gibson's golden age so unusual in American manufacturing. They'd figured out how to mass-produce aspiration. And during the Second World War, when the men who'd staffed the factory left for the military, the women of Kalamazoo kept the production lines running. Gibson's wartime instruments, the so-called banner guitars, named for the small banner reading, "Only a Gibson is good enough," printed inside the headstock, were built by a largely female workforce using the same tools, the same wood, the same standards. Collectors prize banner-era instruments today, partly for their surprisingly light construction. Wartime material restrictions meant thinner bracing, which opened up the sound, and partly for what they represent, that the skill was in the hands, not in the gender of the hands. By the late 1950s, Gibson wasn't a company so much as a cultural institution. Kalamazoo called itself the home of guitars, and the claim was barely an exaggeration. At one point, 85% of fretted, stringed instruments manufactured in the United States came from this corner of southwestern Michigan. The name on the headstock had traveled from the factory floor to stages in Chicago and Memphis and Nashville and New York and London. It was in the hands of players who were rewriting what American music sounded like, and it carried a meaning that no advertising campaign could have manufactured. The Les Paul, that heavy, sustaining, warm-toned, solid body that McCarty and Les Paul had introduced in 1952, had become the instrument of rock and blues. The combination of a mahogany body, a carved maple top, and PAF humbucking pickups produced a voice unlike anything else. Thick, creamy when clean, snarling when overdriven, capable of a singing sustain that let a single note hang in the air like a held breath. Players chose it not because Gibson's marketing told them to, but because nothing else sounded that way. When a guitarist walked on stage holding a Les Paul Standard with a sunburst finish and gold hardware, the audience understood something before a single note was played. This person is serious about their instrument, and you should be serious about listening. The ES-335 did the same thing for a different constituency. Introduced in 1958, the semi-hollow body split the difference between the warmth of a full arch top and the sustain and feedback resistance of a solid body. B.B. King adopted the thin-line shape, playing his beloved Lucille, an ES-355, night after night through decades of touring, and gave the instrument a blues pedigree that no competitor could match. Larry Carlton made the 335 the voice of studio sophistication. Chuck Berry had already made the ES-350T the sound of rock and roll's first decade. The semi-hollow category that McCarty's team created didn't just fill a gap in the market. It opened a territory that hadn't existed before. And then there were the designs that were too far ahead of their moment. The Flying V and the Explorer, both released in 1958, were so radical in their angular geometry that dealers didn't know where to hang them, and players didn't know what to make of them. Initial sales were dismal. Fewer than 100 of each model shipped in the first run. Gibson quietly shelved them. 2 decades later, when heavy metal and hard rock needed instruments that looked as aggressive as the music sounded, those same designs became some of the most sought-after guitars in the world. Original 1958 Explorers trade for $500,000. McCarty's team had designed the future and been punished for it, then vindicated by time. Under McCarty, Gibson achieved something that most corporations chase and never catch: cultural authority that felt earned rather than purchased. The instruments weren't prestigious because of the price. They were expensive because of the prestige, because the musicians who shaped American popular music had chosen them, played them until the lacquer wore through to bare wood, and handed them down to the next generation not as collectibles, but as working tools. A 1959 Les Paul Standard wasn't a museum piece when it was new. It was a guitar. It became irreplaceable because the person who played it made irreplaceable music with it. Kalamazoo felt the pride directly. The factory wasn't just the town's largest employer, it was the engine around which the town's social life organized itself. Multi-generational employment was common. A father on the finishing line, a son in the neck shop, a daughter-in-law in the wiring department. Workers knew that the instrument they'd shaped and inspected that morning might be in the hands of someone famous by Friday, and that knowledge gave the work a dignity that transcended the hourly wage. The union local wasn't just a bargaining unit, it was part of the town's architecture, alongside the diners where second shift workers ate supper at midnight, and the bars where Friday paychecks arrived with weight. What Gibson sold to Kalamazoo wasn't just jobs. It was continuity, inheritance, and identity. The sense that the work mattered, that the product mattered, that the name on the headstock was a shared possession between the people who built the instruments and the people who played them. That relationship felt permanent. The kind of thing that could last as long as people still wanted to play guitars. Nobody intended to disrupt it. Not yet. The peak wasn't a single calendar year. It was an era. The McCarty period, especially the mid-1950s through the early 1960s, when Gibson was simultaneously scaling production, minting iconic models, and accumulating a cultural significance that most companies spend generations trying to achieve and never quite reach. The numbers tell part of it. Under McCarty, Gibson went from 5,000 instruments a year to more than 100,000. Employment climbed from 150 to 1,200. Revenue grew in proportion. The product line expanded to cover virtually every style of American guitar playing. Solid bodies, semi-hollows, full arch tops, flat top acoustics, classical guitars, mandolins, banjos. If you played a fretted instrument in America between 1950 and 1965, Gibson either made your first choice or made the instrument you aspired to own. But the numbers miss the deeper achievement. What McCarty built wasn't just a manufacturing operation. It was a system for translating craft into culture. Gibson's instruments reached the hands that mattered. The players on the recordings that defined rock and roll, rhythm and blues, jazz, country, and the instruments became part of the identity of the music itself. You couldn't separate the sound of a Les Paul from the sound of the music played on it. They were the same thing. McCarty understood that this relationship was the real product, more valuable than any individual guitar, and he'd spent nearly 2 decades nurturing it through good instruments, consistent quality, and the instinct to let players lead while the factory followed. The bitter irony is that Gibson already possessed exactly what its later management would claim to be chasing. Henry Juszkiewicz, decades later, would talk about turning Gibson into a music lifestyle company, as if the brand needed to become something larger than instruments to justify its existence. But standing at the summit of the McCarty era, Gibson was already the most powerful lifestyle brand in American music. It just didn't call itself that. It didn't need to. The lifestyle was in the instrument, in the way a Les Paul felt in your hands, in the way the headstock looked under stage lights, in the way a player's identity fused with the guitar they'd chosen. That was the lifestyle. It was real, and it was worth more than any acquisition could buy. McCarty left Gibson in 1966. He was 63, and he'd done what he came to do. The company he left behind was one of the most successful instrument manufacturers in the world, profitable, prestigious, and deeply embedded in the culture of American music. What followed was a slow, quiet erosion. ECL, the brewing and electronics conglomerate that controlled Gibson through its parent company Norland, brought different instincts: volume over craft, efficiency over refinement. The workers on Parsons Street could feel it, not as a single dramatic change, but as a gradual loosening, the way a truss rod backs off 1/4 turn at a time. Neck profiles that used to be hand-checked moved through a little faster. Finishes that used to get 5 coats got 4. Quality control that used to catch the marginal instrument started letting it pass. Players noticed too. By the early 1970s, the phrase pre-CBS Fender had an equivalent forming around Gibson. The sense that the instruments made before the corporate owners arrived were better, more carefully assembled, more worthy of the name. It wasn't entirely fair. Plenty of fine Gibsons were built in the Norland years, but perception has its own momentum. And once the reputation for declining quality took hold, every instrument that left Kalamazoo had to argue against it. That was the summit. The highest point before the wind shifted, and the distance between what Gibson was and what Gibson would become was already opening. Quietly, the way a crack in nitrocellulose lacquer starts as a hairline and runs slowly until it reaches the edge of the body and there's no way to pretend it isn't there. Gibson had already lost one home before it lost its way. The guitar market softened in the 1970s. Disco didn't need 6 strings. Synthesizers were the new sound of the future. Electric guitar sales dropped industry-wide, and Gibson, weighed down by Norland's corporate overhead, a growing reputation for inconsistent quality, and management that understood beer distribution better than instrument making, felt it harder than most. The workforce on Parsons Street thinned. The factory that had once hummed with 1,000 workers operated at a fraction of its wartime capacity. Departments that used to run 2 shifts cut back to 1, and then the one got shorter. The Norland years had done real damage to the instruments themselves. Cost-cutting decisions made in corporate offices far from Kalamazoo filtered down to the production floor in ways that players could see, feel, and hear. Maple tops got thinner. Hardware quality dropped. Gibson introduced multi-piece bodies on some models, laminations where solid planks used to be, because it was cheaper, even though seasoned players could tell the difference in tone and resonance. The Les Paul, which had been temporarily discontinued in 1960 and revived in 1968 after vintage models started commanding premium prices, returned in a form that veteran Gibson workers privately admitted wasn't as good as what they'd built under McCarty. The carved top was still there, the principle was still there, but the execution had softened and the market noticed. Vintage Gibson instruments from the 1950s began climbing to prices that made the new models look like compromises. The past was becoming worth more than the present. Norland's response was not to fix Gibson, it was to hedge. In 1974, the company opened a second manufacturing facility in Nashville, Tennessee. The stated rationale was expansion, a new plant in a southern city with lower labor costs, closer to the country music market, with room to grow in ways that landlocked Kalamazoo couldn't offer. But the workers on Parsons Street understood the unspoken logic immediately. They'd watched the same playbook run in the auto industry, in furniture, in textiles. The southern plant doesn't complement the northern one. It replaces it. The announcement wasn't an expansion plan. It was a notice of future obsolescence, written in the polite language of corporate strategy. The transition was slow enough to be agonizing. Through the late 1970s, production shifted south in stages. Kalamazoo kept the acoustic guitar lines and some electric assembly, but the center of gravity moved. In 1981, Gibson stopped making electric guitars on Parsons Street entirely. The acoustics held on a few more years. Craftspeople who'd spent decades shaping spruce tops and bending rosewood sides, still doing the work, still punching in, still watching the numbers drop. In 1984, Gibson closed the Kalamazoo factory for good. The date is easy to write and difficult to absorb. Parsons Street had been Gibson's home since 1917. 67 years of mandolins, archtops, flat tops, electric guitars, banjos. 67 years of wood arriving raw and leaving as instruments that ended up in concert halls and dive bars and recording studios and living rooms across the country. Workers who'd given the plant 20 and 30 years walked out for the last time, carrying whatever personal tools and belongings they could fit in their hands. Some followed the work to Nashville, 800 miles away, uprooting families and replanting them in a city where they knew nobody and where summer arrived in March and never left. Most stayed in Kalamazoo and looked for other work in a Michigan economy that was itself contracting under the weight of auto industry layoffs and the general hollowing out of Midwest manufacturing. Kalamazoo didn't collapse the way a single employer's steel town collapses. The city had other industries, other employers, other reasons to exist. But it lost something the statistics don't fully capture. The identity of the home of guitars didn't disappear overnight, but it thinned. The lunch spots that had fed second shift workers lost their late night regulars. The supply chain of small vendors, wood suppliers, hardware fabricators, lacquer distributors that had orbited the Gibson factory contracted. The particular pride of living in the place where those instruments were made, of knowing that the Les Paul in a magazine advertisement had been shaped and finished and inspected by someone you might sit next to at church? That pride migrated south with the production line and left an absence in its place. A small group refused to let the skill die with the factory. Jim Dearlew, Marvin Lamb, J.P. Moats, and Bill Page, all longtime Gibson builders, men who'd spent their careers learning the particular discipline of the carved top and the hand-shaped neck, formed Heritage Guitar in 1985. They set up shop in part of the old Parsons Street complex, using some of the same tools Gibson had left behind, and began building guitars the way they'd always built them, by hand, one at a time, to standards that owed more to the McCarty era than to anything Norlin had imposed. Heritage was never going to be Gibson. It was too small, too local, too stubbornly artisanal to compete on scale, but its existence was a declaration that the craft belonged to the people who practiced it, not to the corporation that had moved on. 2 years after the Kalamazoo closure, Gibson changed hands again. In January 1986, Henry Juszkiewicz, David Berryman, and Gary Zabrowski bought Gibson from Norlin for a sum widely reported to be around $5 million. $5 million for one of the most storied brand names in American music, the company that had built the Les Paul and the ES-335 and the instruments that soundtracked the 20th century. The price alone tells you how deeply Norlin had damaged the enterprise, how thoroughly a decade and a half of corporate neglect had drained a name that once represented the finest instruments in the world. Juszkiewicz took the CEO role, and in the early years, he looked like exactly the person the company needed. He was aggressive, confident, and obsessed with the instruments. He invested in the Nashville factory's production quality, upgrading machinery, tightening inspection standards, hiring people who cared about the difference between an instrument that was acceptable and one that was right. He expanded the custom shop division, which built high-end reproductions of the most coveted vintage models, faithful recreations of the 1959 Les Paul Standard, the ES-335 neck, the instruments that collectors were paying tens of thousands of dollars for on the vintage market. If Gibson could build new versions that captured even a fraction of that old magic, the custom shop could charge premium prices and deliver premium margins. Under Henry's early leadership, it worked. The guitars improved, the brand stabilized. Players who'd written Gibson off during the Norlin years started paying attention again. Henry was combative in ways that sometimes served the company and sometimes foreshadowed trouble. In 2009 and again in 2011, federal agents raided Gibson's Nashville and Memphis facilities, alleging that the company had imported endangered hardwoods, ebony and rosewood, in violation of the Lacey Act, which governs trade in protected plant and animal species. Gibson settled in 2012, paying a $300,000 penalty and forfeiting the seized wood. Juszkiewicz publicly framed the raids as government overreach, turning the episode into a cause célèbre among conservative media and positioning himself as a CEO willing to fight federal bureaucrats to protect American manufacturing. Whether the raids were justified or overblown depended on who you asked. What they revealed, unmistakably, was Henry's temperament, a man who didn't back down, who interpreted challenge as confirmation of his own correctness, and who could turn any fight into a story about his own resolve. That temperament would serve him poorly when the challenge came not from federal agents, but from his own customers. For 2 decades, the core strategy was sound. Build better guitars, serve the core customer, let the instruments do the talking. Gibson's reputation recovered. Revenue grew. The custom shop became one of the most respected workshops in the industry. Henry Juszkiewicz had, by any reasonable measure, rescued the company. The trouble began when rescue wasn't enough, when Henry looked at what Gibson was, the greatest guitar company in the world, and decided it should be something more. The transformation happened in stages, each one a little further from the wood. Henry Juszkiewicz had spent 20 years rebuilding Gibson into a profitable, prestigious guitar company, and somewhere in those years he'd arrived at a conviction that would consume everything he'd built. That guitars weren't big enough, that the brand's cultural weight could carry a much larger business, that Gibson should become, in his words, a music lifestyle company, not just an instrument maker, but a consumer electronics empire that touched every part of how people experienced sound. The early acquisitions stayed in familiar territory. Gibson bought Slingerland drums. It acquired Baldwin pianos. It picked up Oberheim synthesizers and the Garrison guitar brand. These were adjacent moves, still inside the music industry, still connected to the identity of a company that made instruments. The player community didn't panic. The balance sheet absorbed the costs, and each successful deal gave Juszkiewicz more confidence that the next one could be bigger. The next ones were bigger. Gibson acquired Stanton, the DJ turntable and equipment company, in 2012. It bought TEEAC and its Tascam professional audio division. It invested in Cakewalk, the music software company. Each acquisition pulled Gibson further from the workshop floor in Nashville and deeper into the consumer technology market, a market with different economics, different margins, different competitive dynamics, and different customers. Then came Wooks. In April 2014, Gibson Brands announced an agreement to acquire Wooks Innovations, Philips' audio, home entertainment, and accessories business, for a reported $135 million, plus an ongoing brand license fee that would allow Gibson to continue selling products under the Philips name. The deal was transformative in scale and in ambition. Wooks brought headphones, Bluetooth speakers, sound bars, home theater systems, and multimedia accessories, the kind of consumer electronics you'd find at Best Buy or Target, sold in volumes that dwarfed guitar sales, at margins that made guitar margins look like a different business entirely, which of course they were. Juszkiewicz described the Wooks acquisition as a strategic leap. Gibson Brands, the company had already rebranded itself from Gibson Guitar Corporation to Gibson Brands, Inc. The name change itself, a signal that guitars were no longer the whole story, would become a global player in consumer audio. The Philips brand would give Gibson instant retail credibility in electronics markets across Europe and Asia, where the Gibson name meant nothing outside of music stores. The combined entity, Henry argued, would be worth far more than the pieces. He told the press that the acquisition positioned Gibson to reach $1 billion in revenue. $1 billion. For a company whose guitar business, while profitable, operated at a fraction of that scale. The pieces, however, were purchased with debt. To fund the acquisitions, Wooks, and the string of smaller deals that preceded it, Gibson borrowed at rates that reflected the risk lenders saw in the strategy. Senior secured notes at 8.875%. Bank credit lines. The kind of layered corporate debt that functions smoothly when revenue is growing and becomes a trap when it isn't. By 2018, Gibson's total debt load had reached approximately $375 million in senior secured notes due August 1st, plus roughly $145 million in revolving credit and term loan obligations coming due even sooner. The combined burden, north of $500 million, sat on top of a company whose core profitable business was still, underneath all the lifestyle rhetoric, building and selling guitars. Consumer electronics did not cooperate with the plan. The Wooks-derived business competed in a market where the dominant players, Samsung, Sony, Bose, Apple, JBL, operated at scale advantages Gibson couldn't touch. Their R&D budgets dwarfed Gibson's total revenue. Their distribution networks were global. Their brand recognition in electronics was decades deep. Gibson was selling Philips-branded headphones against companies that could absorb losses on individual product lines without flinching. The margins were thin. The competition was merciless. The revenue projections that had justified the debt didn't materialize. Meanwhile, back in Nashville and Memphis, the guitars were losing the argument too, not because people had stopped wanting them, but because the instruments themselves were suffering. Gibson's G-Force self-tuning system, built on technology licensed from the German company Tronicle, became the most visible and most hated symbol of management overreach. The system replaced traditional tuning machines with motorized pegs controlled by a processor mounted behind the headstock. Strum the open strings, press a button, and the guitar tuned itself in seconds. Juszkiewicz believed robot tuning was the future, that it would make Gibson instruments smarter, more accessible, and more appealing to a generation of players raised on technology. In 2015, He made G-force standard equipment across most of Gibson's USA-made electric guitar range. Every Les Paul standard, every SG standard, every ES335 shipped with robot tuners installed. You couldn't opt out. The future, Henry decided, was mandatory. The player community's response was not polite disagreement. It was open revolt. Gibson's core customers, the players who'd chosen the brand because of its connection to tradition, to hand craftsmanship, to the feeling of a simple, elegant instrument that did one thing extraordinarily well, viewed the robot tuners as an act of contempt. The system added weight to the headstock. It altered the balance of the guitar. It required a battery. It introduced electronic complexity into an instrument that players valued precisely for its analog simplicity. The tuning feel was different. The mechanical resistance of a motorized peg doesn't match the smooth turn of a traditional Kluson-style tuner. And for players who tune by ear dozens of times a day, that difference matters. Dealers reported customers walking away from 2015 models. Online forums filled with photographs of G-force systems ripped out and replaced with traditional tuning machines. Players paying extra on top of Gibson's already premium prices to remove the feature that Gibson had forced on them. Some dealers quietly offered to swap the tuners before delivery, absorbing the labor cost just to make the sale. The signal from the market was unmistakable. Gibson's most loyal customers were spending their own money to undo what Gibson had done. Juszkiewicz, by multiple accounts from people who worked with him during this period, interpreted the backlash as resistance to innovation rather than as feedback about the product. He believed the players would come around. They didn't. And the robot tuners, for all the fury they generated, were only the most photogenic symptom of a deeper problem. Quality control across Gibson's standard production lines had deteriorated through the mid-2000s. Players reported sloppy fretwork, fret ends that protruded beyond the binding, uneven fret heights that caused buzzing, poorly cut nuts that choked the strings. Finish defects that the McCarty era inspectors would have caught and sent back were making it into dealers' hands. Whether these issues stemmed from cost-cutting to service the debt, from management distraction as the electronics empire demanded more attention, or from the institutional erosion that happens when a company's leadership stops caring about the original product, the result was the same. The instruments that carried Gibson's name were too often not worthy of it. Pat Foley, who served as Gibson's chief merchant officer, would later describe the strategic confusion with devastating precision. The company, he said, had tried to become a global lifestyle brand rather than the greatest guitar company in the world. That single sentence is the epitaph for the Juszkiewicz era. Gibson was already the greatest guitar company in the world, or had every right to be, with its history, its designs, its cultural capital. The lifestyle ambition didn't build on that foundation. It hollowed it out. Steve Christmas, who ran the custom shop division during the electronics years, offered testimony that made the financial dynamics concrete. The custom shop was the cash engine, Christmas explained. It generated strong margins by building the handcrafted, high-end instruments that Gibson's most devoted customers wanted, faithful recreations of vintage Les Pauls and ES335s, finished with the same nitrocellulose lacquer and the same hand-wound pickups that made the originals legendary. Demand was strong. Waiting lists were long. The custom shop was proof that Gibson's core identity, craftsmanship, heritage, the sound of the wood, still commanded premium prices in a competitive market. And that revenue, the money produced by the part of the company that was working, was being funneled into the consumer electronics expansion. Custom shop profits subsidized Philips' headphone losses. The high-margin guitar business covered the low-margin electronics shortfalls. The part of Gibson that people loved was paying for the part that nobody had asked for. The feedback loops were lethal. The debt required interest payments of roughly $33 million a year on the senior notes alone. To meet those payments, Gibson needed the guitar business to perform. But the guitar business was suffering from quality problems driven partly by cost pressures created by the debt. Players who encountered sloppy fretwork or finished defects on a $2,500 Les Paul didn't just return the guitar, they posted about it online, in forums and social media channels, where Gibson's reputation was debated daily by the people who cared most about it. Each bad instrument that escaped quality control became an advertisement for the competition. Fender was improving. PRS was thriving. Japanese manufacturers were building instruments of startling quality at lower price points. Gibson's customers had alternatives, and Gibson was giving them reasons to explore them. Each decision in the chain made the next one harder to reverse. The debt required revenue to service. The electronics business required investment to survive. The guitar business required quality to justify its premium. There wasn't enough money, managerial bandwidth, or institutional focus to serve all three demands at once. Something had to give. What gave first was the quality of the guitars. What gave last was the balance sheet. And by the time the balance sheet gave, the margin for recovery had been compressed to almost nothing. By early 2018, Gibson's financial position had narrowed to a quarter with no exit signs. The $375 million in senior secured notes carried an interest rate of 8.875%. Expensive money, reflecting the risk that lenders had priced into the company years before the crisis became public. Those notes matured on August 1st, 2018. The roughly $145 million in bank debt came due sooner. Gibson needed to refinance, restructure, or repay more than $500 million within months, and the company's operating results gave creditors no reason to offer favorable terms. Gibson Innovations, the consumer electronics arm, the Wooks legacy, the Philips-branded headphones and audio gear, was losing money. The division that was supposed to justify the debt was instead accelerating the crisis. Revenue fell short of projections. Margins were negative or negligible. The competitive dynamics that should have been obvious from the start, that a guitar company cannot out-execute Samsung in consumer electronics, had played out exactly as skeptics predicted. The guitar business was still profitable. The custom shop still generated cash. The core still worked. But the core alone couldn't service the debt that the periphery had created. In February 2018, Gibson missed a bond interest payment. That single missed payment, roughly $16 million in interest on the senior secured notes, triggered the cascade that everyone in the financial press had been watching for. It was the formal acknowledgement that Gibson could not service its own debt. The company that had once dominated American guitar making couldn't make a quarterly interest payment on the money it had borrowed to sell Bluetooth speakers. The credit agencies downgraded the company's debt to levels that signaled imminent default. Financial reporters began calling industry sources, former employees, guitar dealers. The word bankruptcy appeared in headlines beside a name that had always appeared beside words like legendary and iconic. The story was out, and the story was ugly. On May 1st, 2018, Gibson Brands Inc. filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. The filing listed assets of between $100 million and $500 million in liabilities in the same range. The euphemism of the range obscured the reality. The company owed more than the company was worth, and the difference was measured in the hundreds of millions. Bankruptcy. The same legal mechanism that had swallowed Lehman Brothers and General Motors and Kodak applied to the company that had built the Les Paul, applied to the name that Orville Gibson had carved into his first mandolin in Kalamazoo, more than a century before a federal judge in Delaware would review the petition. The guitar community reacted with a mixture of grief and grim satisfaction. The grief was real. Gibson meant something to people who played its instruments, something deeper than brand loyalty, something closer to identity. The satisfaction was grimmer. Years of complaints about declining quality, about robot tuners forced onto unwilling customers, about a CEO who seemed to care more about Bluetooth speakers than about whether the frets on a $2,000 Les Paul were properly crowned. All of it had been validated in the most public and humiliating way possible. The players had been right. The market had been right. And now a bankruptcy court would sort out the consequences. For the workers in Nashville and Memphis, the filing meant something more immediate and more frightening. Bankruptcy proceedings come with uncertainty about layoffs, about benefit continuity, about whether the factory doors will stay open next month. The DIP financing was supposed to provide that assurance, but legal assurance and emotional assurance are different things. People who build guitars for a living, who arrive at work each morning to shape wood and solder wiring and spray lacquer, were now reading about their employer in the business press alongside phrases like restructuring support agreement and debtor in possession and wind down of non-core assets. The language was clinical. The fear was not. The restructuring support agreement was already negotiated by the time the filing was made. Gibson's creditors and management had worked out the terms in advance, a pre-packaged bankruptcy designed to minimize the time in court and preserve the going concern. Gibson would receive $135 million in debtor-in-possession financing to keep the factories running, the workers paid, the supply chain intact during the reorganization. The DIP lenders weren't performing charity. They were making a bet that the guitar business, stripped of the electronics deadweight, was worth saving. Gibson Innovations would be wound down. Sold off, shut down, dissolved. The consumer electronics empire, the headphones, the soundbars, the Philips-branded audio gear, the entire Wusk's legacy was over. The lifestyle vision was over. The billion-dollar ambition was over. The company would, in the language of the press release, reorganize around core businesses. Core businesses. Musical instruments and professional audio. Guitars. For a company like Gibson, that sentence carried a weight that the lawyers who drafted it may not have fully appreciated. It meant that Gibson was admitting, in a federal bankruptcy court, that it needed to go back to what it was, that the detour had failed, that the empire had collapsed, that the answer to the question of what Gibson should be was the same answer it had always been, the answer that Orville Gibson had given in 1894 and Ted McCarty had perfected in the 1950s, a company that makes instruments worthy of the name on the headstock. Henry Juszkiewicz remained during the early months of the reorganization. He spoke publicly about the brand's enduring strength, about the restructuring as a necessary step that would free Gibson to pursue its mission without the weight of the debt. He framed the bankruptcy not as a failure of strategy, but as a financial reset. The corporate language of a man who still believed the vision had been right and the market had been wrong. But the creditors now held effective control of Gibson's fate. The note holders who'd extended the DIP financing weren't interested in lifestyle visions or strategic pivots. They wanted their money back. And the surest path to repayment was the one that Juszkiewicz had spent a decade trying to transcend. Guitars. The instruments that people still wanted to buy, the products that still carried pricing power and brand loyalty, the business that still worked, that had always worked, even while everything built on top of it was failing. Henry fought to stay. By the accounts that emerged later from people close to the reorganization, he believed until the end that the electronic strategy had been sound, that execution had been undermined by market timing, by insufficient scale, by factors outside his control. The numbers said otherwise. The numbers said the vision had been given $135 million in acquisition costs, hundreds of millions in supporting debt, and years of management attention diverted from the core product, and it had returned operating losses, plummeting guitar quality, a player revolt over robot tuners, and a federal bankruptcy filing. By October 2018, Henry Juszkiewicz was out. 32 years. He'd run Gibson longer than Ted McCarty, longer than anyone else in the company's history. He'd arrived in 1986 as a rescuer, buying a damaged brand from disinterested corporate owners for $5 million and rebuilding it through sharper focus and better instruments. He'd revived the custom shop. He'd restored the name to a position of respect. He'd turned Gibson from a Norlin-era casualty into a thriving instrument company, and then he'd nearly killed it by deciding that what it was, the greatest guitar company in the world, wasn't enough. The tragedy of Henry Juszkiewicz is not the tragedy of a villain. It is the tragedy of a person who succeeded so completely at one task that he couldn't accept its limits, who looked at the summit and saw a ceiling, who believed his own judgment was more reliable than his customers' purchasing decisions, and borrowed $500 million against that belief. He saved Gibson once. Then he tried to save it again from a problem that didn't exist, and the rescue nearly finished the patient. Gibson emerged from bankruptcy in November 2018 under new management and a mandate that amounted to a public confession. The company would go back to making guitars, and the guitars would be good. James J.C. Curley arrived as president and CEO, a branding executive who'd spent years at Levi Strauss, another American heritage company that had learned, through its own near-death experiences, what happens when you abandon the core product in pursuit of diversification. Cesar Guequian, a lifelong guitarist and music industry veteran, came aboard as chief merchant officer, responsible for the product line. The symbolism of the new leadership was deliberate. A brand specialist who understood the danger of brand drift, and a musician who understood what players actually wanted. The 2019 product lineup was the clearest possible statement of intent. Gone were the robot tuners. Gone was the Gibson Innovations branding. Gone were the bloated model designations and the spec sheet features that served the marketing department more than the player. In their place, the original collection. Les Paul standards and customs built to vintage-inspired specs. SGs with the slim taper necks and the cherry finishes that players associated with the early 1960s. ES 335s with dot neck inlays, and the warm, woody tone that had made the model a standard since 1958. The names themselves were the message. Gibson was returning to the years when the instruments didn't need a technological gimmick to justify their existence. The Murphy Lab, launched in 2020, extended the return further. Tom Murphy, a master luthier who'd been aging and finishing guitars at Gibson for decades, oversaw a program that produced new instruments designed to look, feel, and resonate like vintage guitars, down to the checked nitrocellulose lacquer, the oxidized nickel hardware, the specific amber tone of a 60-year-old sunburst. It was craftsmanship in the explicit service of memory. And it sold. Murphy Lab instruments priced at $5,000, $7,000, even $10,000 and above carried waiting lists. Gibson's most dedicated customers hadn't vanished during the bankruptcy. They'd been waiting for Gibson to remember them, but survival doesn't undo damage. And Gibson's story, unlike most American industrial collapse narratives, has two sets of ruins. In Kalamazoo, the original Parsons Street factory still stands, partially occupied by Heritage Guitar, partially converted to other uses, partially just old. The building exists. The 1,000-worker force that once filled it does not. The oral histories collected by Western Michigan University, voices of people like Marvin Lamb, Margaret Sines, Annie Hatfield, Donna Seibart, Linda Bradford, George Rohr, describe a specific kind of American working life that these walls once contained. The smell of lacquer in the morning, the sound of the buffing wheels, the satisfaction of holding a finished instrument and knowing your hands had helped shape it. That life persists in memory and in transcript. It does not persist on the factory floor. In Memphis, the factory where Gibson once built its semi-hollow and hollow body guitars, the ES 335s, the arch tops, the instruments that connected the modern lineup back to Lloyd Loar and Orville's carved top principle, closed in 2019 during the post-bankruptcy consolidation. Production moved to Nashville. The Memphis building was later occupied by FedEx Logistics. The space where someone once hand-bent binding around the rim of a semi-hollow body now handles package routing. The conversion is ordinary. That ordinariness is the point. Nashville remains. The factory runs. The instruments, by most professional accounts, are better than they've been in years. Quality control has tightened. Setups are more consistent. The post-bankruptcy Gibsons have won back players who drifted to competitors during the electronics years. The brand has stabilized. Revenue has recovered. Gibson is, again, a guitar company. It is also a company with a shorter memory than it used to have. The workers who walked out during the restructuring, the people who carried institutional knowledge in their hands and their ears, who could hear a pickup imbalance before it showed on a meter, or feel a neck contour that was a 32nd of an inch off, not all of them came back. That kind of knowledge doesn't live in a training manual. It lives in years of repetition, passed from one pair of hands to the next. Some of it survived the bankruptcy. Some of it didn't. Gibson didn't die. That matters. In the long chronicle of American industrial loss, survival is not the expected ending. Kalamazoo lost its factory. Memphis lost its factory. The company nearly drowned in $500 million of debt, chasing a future that didn't want it. And yet Gibson exists. The headstock still carries the name. The instruments still carry the sound. But this story was never really about bankruptcy filings or restructuring agreements or the particular hubris of one CEO who believed he knew better than his customers. It's about the distance between a company and the thing it's supposed to do. Orville Gibson carved instruments out of solid wood because he believed the shape of the wood determined the quality of the sound. That principle was true in 1894. It was true on Parsons Street in 1955, when 1,000 workers moved 1,000 instruments a day through a building organized around that idea. It was true in 2015, when a motorized tuning peg was bolted to the headstock of a guitar that had never needed one. It remains true now in the Murphy Lab and the original collection, and every instrument that leaves Nashville with the split diamond inlay above the nut. Gibson nearly destroyed itself, not by forgetting how to build guitars, but by deciding that building great guitars was no longer enough. The rescue wasn't a reinvention. It was a return. The company survived not by finding some brilliant new future, but by going back to the past it had treated as insufficient. The old shapes, the old wood, the old carved-top principle that had started everything in a Kalamazoo workshop more than a century ago. The Parsons Street factory still stands at the edge of its old neighborhood, big enough to remind you what once happened inside it, quiet enough to tell you that it doesn't happen there anymore. In Nashville, the work continues. Someone is shaping a mahogany neck. Someone is spraying nitrocellulose lacquer in thin coats. Someone is pressing fret wire into a rosewood board and checking the level with a straight edge, doing the thing that Gibson has done since Orville first carved a mandolin top and held it up to the light. A Gibson guitar, built right, can last 100 years. The company that builds them almost didn't make it to the next one.